For this integration project, we're going to explore how three elements, very important basic structures in Java, work together. The three structures are going to be arrays, which is a basic data structure. We're going to talk about looping, which means you can go through the items in the array, and an if statement. Now this is it's a simple example, but it really shows you how the three work together. You will find that arrays and looping are pretty much coupled, and that is that they almost work together. If you have an array, you pretty much does, and you have to actually be able to work through the elements of the array. Remember that an array is simply a variable with a subscript, and so that subscript, it's important that we can actually go to the 0th, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd element. So our goal today is to create an application that does something very simple, and that is it takes an item declares an array, and at random assigns the 5 elements of the array, which are these magic numbers that the user has to guess. So we're not going to actually assign. What we're going to do instead is we're going to actually allow the computer to choose 5 numbers at random. So I worked out a kind of basic outline here. So we're going to walk through this so you can see how this works. At the beginning, of course, we need to declare our array of numbers, and we're going to call that num. So these are going to be the 5 magic numbers that the user is trying to guess. So if the user guesses any one of those 5, they win. We're going to have some utility variables here that we're going to use. We're going to have a variable called guess, which is going to store the user's guess each time. So each time in the loop, that's going to change, and when the user guesses that value. And I is simply going to be at what point are we in the loop, the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th. Then we're going to declare a Boolean variable, which is going to keep track of whether or not the item has been found. So this will be very helpful in the sense that we're going to start out by saying it was false, but then we're going to actually check to see whether or not, if it ever is found, we're going to set the Boolean value to be true. Now, of course, we need to actually go through and assign 5 values to the array, that is from 1 to 100. We're going to do that, and then we're going to prompt the user to guess a number between 1 and 100. Now, if the user, so then we're going to set I to be 0, and then we're going to start our loop. We're going to increment I. Actually, that's probably going to need to be moved down here because we're going to start with the ith element, which is going to be 0, so that needs to be moved down. So the first thing we're going to do in the loop is whether or not the ith element in the array. So in other words, if the user guesses 12, we're going to have to go through and see is 12 equal to any of the items that are in the array. So we're going to have to go through and go through all 5 to see whether or not it is true. If it is true, that is, if the guess is equal to one of the elements in the array, we're going to set this found variable to be true. If it's not, we basically don't have to do anything. We'll just continue the loop. And we'll end the loop, we'll continue to run the loop as long as it's not found, that is, that found is false, and that I is less than 5. Now notice that by making I less than 5, we give the user actually, there are going to be 5, there are 5 items in the array, so it's going to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then end. And then of course we will increment I each time in the array. If the item was found, we'll say you win, and if the item wasn't found, we'll say we'll go through and we'll start actually entering this. Now I want to make sure you understand that programming is a skill. It's not something that I can immediately just give to you. You have to practice this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to items in the array, and so we're going to actually declare a new int, and there'll be 5 items in the array. As I was saying, that I'm going to actually replace these statements, but it'd be very useful in these integration projects for you to do this yourself. So obviously I'm going to give you the answer to this, but that in and of itself is not going to be very valuable. What I would do, and what I strongly suggest, is right now turn off the video and try this yourself. Write the code to actually do it yourself, now that I've given you the outline. So I'm going to continue to do this. We're going to declare integers. So we're going to have int, and obviously we've got here we've got guess and I. We'll set I equal to 0. We've got to declare a Boolean. and we're going to call Boolean found, and we'll set that equal to false. All right. We need a random number generator, so we're going to use, if you remember, there is random, and you could say random, spell random right. Random, we're going to call this randint equals new random. Now this is a built-in random number generator that is built into Java. Now you do need to import random, but the nice thing is by typing that in, you can go down here and click on this, and it will actually add the random library for you, so that we're all set to go. Okay, so we have that. And we're going to build on the earlier random number project by saying for. And if you recall, I showed you in the earlier project how to generate a random number between certain values. So we'll say between I is 0. Actually, we don't need int I because we've already declared that. So we'll say I equals 0 because we already declared I up here, so we don't need to actually declare it again. I is going to be less than 5. It's going to be the termination. We're going to run it, and we'll say plus plus. And that's going to be our loop. Now, just to make sure you understand, the goal of this loop is going to be to generate the 5 random numbers. So the first thing we want to do is use num sub I, so that we're actually getting those 5 numbers. And remember, I is going to go from 0 to 4 because it's an array. And we'll say math.abs, and I showed this to you in the earlier integration project. And there's a next int method that will generate the next int. And then we're going to use the modulus division, which we talked about in the earlier video. Now that little procedure right there will generate a random number, 1 and 100. Now I'm going to cheat here. I know you say cheat. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to use a little cheat here because there is a built-in method, and I don't know if I'll show this to you in class or not, but since you're watching this video, I'll give you something here. And I'll show this to you. This is a toString method for the arrays class. And what this does is it's going to actually cheat. Now, normally you would never do this in a game, and that is print out the answers. But what this is going to do is actually print out the num array. So what it'll do is it'll display for us what the 5 answers are. Now, if you're going to actually produce this and run this in production, you wouldn't actually have the answers out there because it's not much of a game if you know what the answers are. But for debugging purposes, this is great because now you can actually much easier test it. So I'm just going to add a little note here. This is for debugging. And this will actually allow us to, when we're running it, to know what the answers are, so it'll be a lot easier to debug. We're also going to need a console application. And I have copied and pasted this scanner to declare this console, and that will allow us to actually enter the value, the guess, basically. What is the user going to be guessing? So let's go ahead and use that, and we'll say guess equals console dot, and since it's an int, we'll say next int. Now again, and we need to actually prompt the user here, so let's put a println statement right before it. We'll say system.out.println. Please enter your guess. And we'll say between 1 and 100. And we'll say instead of println, we'll say print. That will keep it on. And we'll try that. All right. So this is what we have up till now. We've declared our variables. We've created a random object. We have our scanner object as well. We create a loop. And in the loop, inside the loop, we iterate around num sub I, and each time we generate a random number between 1 and 100 and assign that to num sub 0, num sub 1, num sub 2, num sub 3. So those are our 5 special numbers that we need to try to guess. We're going to cheat a little bit here by actually displaying out those 5 numbers so that we can see them for debugging purposes. And then we're going to ask the user to enter a guess. If any of those 5 numbers match, then we're going to actually display that the user wins. So to determine whether or not guessed correctly, we have to have a loop. Think about it. We know what the guess is. Let's suppose we guess 15. Now we have to figure out, is 15 one of those 5 numbers? To do that, we have to iterate through the elements of the array to see whether or not 15 is one of those 5 elements. So let's use a do loop. And we're going to do this while, and we've said that actually down here. So we're into this loop section here. We're actually doing this, and we've completed this part here. So we can take that out. We're going to check whether or not and the ith element in the array equals the guess. So the ith element in the array is going to be num sub I. So we want to say if num sub I equal the guess, then what do we want to do? If it is, we're going to set found equal to true. Now, if we didn't find it, then all we need to do then basically is increment I, like that, because we're just going to keep going. And we're going to continue to go while not found, that is not found, and I is less than 5. And that's what we've said right here. Continue to loop as long as it's and I is less than 5. As long as those two conditions are true, we're going to continue to loop. If any one of them ends up being false, we're going to stop. Now the last thing we're going to say is if the item was found, we're going to print you win, and if the item was not found, we're going to print you lose. So outside of the loop, so we need to terminate the loop with a semicolon here, we're going to say if found. Now remember, if found is true, that means one of those 5 elements was a match. If found is false, it means it never actually changed value. Is that this if statement here is required. So if it's found, we want to say system.out.println you win. Otherwise, system.out.println loser. Okay, like that. Now I'm not everything absolutely correct at this point, and when you're programming you rarely do get it right the first time, as you've probably figured out by now. But if nothing else, we've got a good start here. Let's try it and see what happens. I think we have got everything okay. Let's save, and we're going to run. Now you'll notice down here we actually know now what the answers are. 55, 87, 6, 63, 72. Let's just go ahead and let's guess one of the numbers and see if it works. 63, and we've got an error. Now you'll notice what the error is. It's an index out of bounds exception, and it tells us that we got to the number 5. So that means we've actually exceeded the boundaries of the array. Remember that if we declared an item with 5, there is no such num sub 5. So we've got a debugging error here. That's okay, we need to fix it. Noticed right away is that you'll notice I use I up here in my loop, and then I use I down here again in my loop. And I was incremented here, if you'll notice, and I never reset the value of I. So my guess is that's where, this is a guess, but my guess is that that is where the error is occurring, that I need to actually set I back to 0. So let's try that. Save it and run. Let's try it now. Again, we know what the answers are this time. We have different numbers. Let's guess 39, which is one of the numbers. You win. So that ended up being, at least we know in the positive condition, actually, that we guessed the right number. So if we guess the right number at this point, the program seems to again. Okay, we know what the right numbers are. Let's guess a number that is not in the list. Let's say 35. Looks like we got it right. Looks like we got it right. Now, I believe this program is correct now, and you'll notice that I made a mistake here by forgetting to reset I. That's okay, and I want to make sure you understand that it's okay for you too. Part of learning how to program is learning how to debug. So I hope this is a good way of trying that it will work for you and you understand how these three integrate together. I'll see you in class.